All right, so today is our sixth recitation, and we're going to go over some quiz 5 solutions. So this is the quiz that was due on Tuesday, and talk about, I guess, the solutions at a large, but also some mistakes that people made that are going to be pretty important to understand later on in the course. And then we're going to start our talk on trajectory optimization, and this is going to be exactly what homework 3 is all about. So homework 3 went out today, and homework 3 is you implement the two most common flavors of trajopt. And we're going to basically talk about when to use which, pluses and minuses of each, and how these stack up to all the different LQRs that we learned. And the idea is that I want everyone to have like a general like taxonomy of all these different methods in their head and know when to use what and what the limitations are of each of the methods. So with that, I'll get started with the quiz solutions. And this shouldn't take long, but there's just one thing that I think that a lot of people made mistakes on that people should understand. So if you haven't seen these yet, if you go on the website under the quizzes tab, we have every quiz. We also have all the solutions for them. So that each quiz I'll just go through and write, what the answer is. And you can see the answers on Canvas as well, but I figured this is a little easier because you can see some explanation. So for the first one, this one's very simple. Is A transpose A positive semi-definite? And the classic proof you'll see for this is right here. I can just factor this into this, which is the same as this, which is the same as a norm. And a norm is always greater than or equal to 0 by definition. That's one of the properties of a norm. So whether it's L1 norm, L2 norm, L infinity norm, it will always be positive. This one is just, go ahead and turn the crank, find back in the notes what it means for a linear system to be controllable, form the controllability matrix, and then just go. And this one, we can solve it with either convex optimization or Riccati recursion. So if we remember, this is our classic time-varying LQR formulation. So LQR, for time-varying LQR, it works when we have linear dynamics, which we have. These matrices are time-varying. They don't have to be, but they can be. Same as finite horizon LQR. And then we have our normal LQR cost function, and we solve for n x's, n-1 states. And what you saw in homework 2 was that if we solve this with convex optimization, or we solve this with the Riccati recursion, we get the same solution for both. The only difference is that the Riccati recursion gives us a feedback policy, where convex optimization just gives us the x's and the u's. And the nice thing about this is that the Riccati recursion does not care about our initial condition. It is globally optimal anywhere. So no matter what this initial condition is, the feedback policy is always globally optimal. And this should have been like a big takeaway from homework 2. Now 4, this is the one that people had the most trouble with, and then I want to spend a little bit of time on. So this one has to do with how do we take problems that have constraints, solve them when we ignore the constraints, and just kind of add them in later. And so if you imagine this, what we have here is that we have a pretty normal looking linear or convex trajopt problem. So we have a nice LQR cost function, our initial condition. So everything up to here, this is just what we saw above. This is our finite horizon LQR problem. And then we have these bound constraints on the controls. And this is super common. So we'll see this with all robotic systems, aerospace systems. Every actuator in the world has a limit. And when we do LQR, we're kind of assuming that there's just no constraints, but we use our penalty on U to kind of keep our control in check. In reality, we want to be a little more specific about the sorts of controls we can use. And sometimes we don't care how much control we use, we just don't want to hit the limit, in which case we can have a pretty low R, but have a constraint in there. So what's very common is that, you'll have some U max. And honestly, I don't really care how much control I use underneath this threshold. I just can't exceed the threshold. And you see that sort of system all the time. And so the issue with trying to fudge costs with or constraints with LQR is that the answer would be if I had to use LQR in a system that had a control constraint like this, what I would do is I would have to jack up the value of R to increase the penalty on control usage to discourage control usage. But what that does is that is going to discourage all control usage. And really, I only want to discourage control usage below some certain threshold. And I'm okay using it here. I just can't use it anywhere above. So this is a super common problem in controls. In robotics, every system will have, these are like joint torque limits. For spacecraft, these would be like your thruster limits, force limits, acceleration limits. All these things end up as control constraints. So the question that this is asking is basically if I ignore these constraints and I just solve this problem above with either Riccati recursion or convex optimization, can I then just clamp these constraints? And what clamping just means is anything that's above the threshold gets clamped down, anything below the threshold gets clamped up. And if you spend some time looking at this right here, this does exactly that. So the idea is that this is like a number line. I have U min and U max. Anything that's above here gets clamped down to U max. Anything below here gets clamped up to U min, and everything in here is unchanged. So this is just what our clamping function means. So you can write this down as this. This is one way to do it. Julia also lets you just use clamp. NumPy, it's called clip, but it's the same idea of just taking values and then I give them a set range they must be in. And if they're within that range, they're fine. If they're outside of that range, they get clamped to be in the range. So then it raises the question of, if I just go ahead and solve this problem without the constraints, can I just clamp U? Not will just satisfy the constraints. So you should really go and try this for a multitude of problems. You'll see this is not true. So you cannot just, after you solve the problem, just go ahead and just project your solution onto feasibility, which is what this is. If you do that, you will get the wrong answer almost every single time. So it's really important that when we have these constraints, if we actually want to deal with them in a way that's optimal, we must include it in the full problem. We can't just solve the problem without the constraints and then project it back onto the constraint set. This does not work. And you should really go ahead and try this for yourself on some simpler problems and like really convince yourself that this does not work. When I have constraints in the problem, I have to actually reason about them in the solver itself. I cannot just like project things after the fact, which is what this is. This is me just projecting my control inputs to be within the bounds. Okay, and then these last two are all about convex functions. These really were just the idea was give you these problems so you can spend some time on your own looking and figuring out which ones are or not convex. And the cool thing is that once you see they are convex, now we can kind of use them for convex trajopt. So the more expressive we can be, the better. And the more of these convex functions that we know and are familiar with, the more expressive we can be in our problems. So here are three really good resources to go through and just look at all sorts of random constraints and costs that are appropriate. And then these two questions just to give you a sense of what is and what isn't. And there's a bunch of like weird stuff in here that seems like it'd be kind of weird, maybe not convex, but actually is convex, which is nice. So feel free to go through this on your own time, figure out what's what. Ooh. Now, first thing I'll do is just one extension on the quiz 5 stuff. Clamping or projecting solutions. And then I'll just say this is bad. Do not do this. And let me give you a very simple example. If I have min say I'm minimizing some nice quadratic and I have some bound constraints, x up, x low. So a really naive way to solve the problem would be to go ahead and solve the unconstrained problem. So I'm going to make it very clear this is do not do this. Do not do this. So if I take this problem and I just ignore the constraints for a second, I have an unconstrained quadratic. This is quite easy to solve. So first thing I do is I get x star equals negative q. So this is unconstrained solution. And then I can just clamp it, all right? I can just say, and again, this is bad. So if I have a problem and I have some constraints that are very easy to project, doesn't matter. Don't do that. If you have constraints in your problem, you must actually reason about them in the problem itself. You cannot solve the unconstrained problem and then project this thing. So this is project into feasible. You cannot do this. This does not work. And it's super important you know this doesn't work because you can go and try it for simple stuff. You'll see that you will get wrong answers every single time. So do not do this. And that's what that LQR question was getting after. And this is why constrained optimization is so important, is because you really have to deal with the constraints. You cannot just like do something lazy like project it later. Okay, so now we did that. I hope everyone's clear on that. I hope you don't see that mistake. So the next thing we're going to talk about is, I guess, the main thing that homework 3 is about. And I guess the main thing a lot of these people took the class for, which is trajectory optimization. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to write down like a canonical problem form, and then we can say which solvers we can use to solve it. So first, we are going to start with our classic form for iterative LQR. So we've talked a lot about, actually, I'll go and I'll just do everything right now, honestly, because I think that if we have a general taxonomy of everything, it's easier to place things in our head as to when we use which solvers. So the first thing we learned about was infinite horizon LQR. And I'll do a lot of copying and pasting right now just to save time. Min x1 n u n minus 1. Oh, this is infinite horizon. So we're going forever. And then subject to x1 equals the initial condition. So what I'm gonna do here is I'll do problem. Actually, let's do problem and solver. And the idea is that we can just write out the problems themselves and write out how we actually solve them. So this first problem, this is infinite horizon LQR, and this we can only solve with one method. Now, next problem. This is, in the most general sense, we'll do time-varying LQR, because remember, infinite horizon LQR is time-varying LQR, but with just constant A's and B's. So time-varying LQR is the most general form of this. So time-varying LQR, I'll just steal this problem. First thing we do is that we add time-varying components, so A and B are allowed to. They don't have to, but they're allowed to change at every time step. And then n minus 1 and n minus 1 plus un, xn. And this is the stage cost. And this is terminal cost. And again, we can solve this with a Riccati recursion. Okay, actually a Riccati or so DARE is a discrete algebraic Riccati equation solver. So you don't have to use the Riccati recursion. You can just use any of these. So when you use control systems.jl and you want to call their function that lets you give it your LQ problem and it will return a feedback policy, it's using one of these under the hood. And rarely do these actually use full Riccati recursions. They use other numerical things. But any sort of a Riccati solver will work for this. Now this we can do, we can solve the Riccati. So we can do Riccati, and this gives us a feedback policy. Or we can use convex optimization, and we can get the variables themselves. Those are our two options. Now, the next thing that we learned about is iterative LQR or differential dynamic programming. And this is where we get into real trajopt kind of stuff. Oh, actually, let me do one last thing. I'll just call it CVX trajopt. And this is just any so here we'll just talk about any convex constraints sort of thing. So I'll do H and this is just going to be any sort of convex problem that we have. And then I'll say must be linear, convex, and then these two must be convex. And to solve this, we can use any convex solver. And now the caveat here is that it must be able to handle the constraints. So I can't use a linear program solver to solve a quadratic program, and I can't use a quadratic program solver to solve a second order cone program. So you can't just use any solver. You have to use any solver that can handle the constraints. So remember, this is like linear program, quadratic program, second order cone program, stuff like that. Rarely will you see anything else other than these. Okay, so these are the three that we've done so far. This was homework 2. In homework 2, we did all of these. And we saw that when you are given problems in these certain forms, here's how we can solve them. And this is a pretty solid set of tools. And so this is what makes up a lot of 90+% of control problems can be solved with one of these. And convex MPC is just me doing trajopt with one of these methods, usually this one. Convex MPC is me just solving this problem for a small horizon every single time step. So these three, this is really like bread and butter robotic stuff. And now we're going to get into some non-convex trajopt. So this is where
I just wanted to confirm the first one is infinite horizon. The second one is finite horizon.
so this one is infinite horizon LQR. So these go to infinity. And then
Right.
time varying LQR is by definition always finite horizon. And so is this.
Okay. Okay. And the first two all only have dynamic constraints, but the third one has other inequality constraints too.
Yes, exactly. So basically,
Ah,
if
okay.
it can fit in this, I can use time varying LQR and solve it. But if I have other weird convex cost functions that aren't the LQR cost functions, so they're not just a quadratic, if I could use, norms or whatever, like in your homework, you used a few other constraints for this. You saw how it works. But also we can add a bunch of other constraints here. And as long as it's convex, I can still solve and form a convex optimization problem. But it needs to be convex, but it doesn't have to be LQR. So, I can put, bound constraints on X and U. I can say that X must be within some norm ball. I can have linear half space constraints. You can do whatever convex thing you want to. As long as the problem is convex, I can still solve it very easily. That's the main takeaway from that.
Okay.
Okay, so now we get into homework 3 territory. And this is where this all gets a lot more interesting is what do we do when we have non-linear dynamics and or non-convex costs and constraints? And these happen all the time in robotics. So the first one we're going to deal with is iLQR GDP. And this is where we just really this is a solution method. So I'll just call it mm, okay, I'll just do nonlinear dynamics, and then I'll write out exactly what I'm talking about. So very importantly, these don't have to be convex. These can be anything. Now, there's no guarantee I can solve it, but they can be anything. And then now for our dynamics, I now have nonlinear dynamics. So I'll just write down some generic. Okay. So this is my problem. If all I have are nonlinear dynamics and constraints, or sorry, and costs that may not be convex, I can still solve this with iterative LQR. And after I go through the taxonomy, I'll talk a little more about these different solvers and when we can use what and what we can actually expect from each of them. When we expect it to work, when it will work, and when maybe it won't work. So I can solve this with iterative LQR or DDP. And remember, these two ideas, these are almost identical. There's just a slight difference in Gauss-Newton versus Full-Newton. Or DIRCOL. So you can solve either of these. But usually we like solving this with iLQR GDP because it's very easy to write ourselves. It's a few hundred lines of code. You can write yourself a solver that can solve pretty nonlinear problems, which is awesome because DIRCOL requires the use of an NLP solver, which is very hard to write yourself and are often very complicated and hard to work with. So usually if you have a problem where the dynamics are not super nonlinear and the costs are nice and convex, which is common because again, in controls, we choose the costs. So we can choose them to be nice and convex. We love using iLQR GDP before using DIRCOL, just as a general rule of thumb. And then I'll take then now if I have so now these don't have to be non-convex, but they're allowed to be non-convex. Now this I can only solve with DIRCOL or now there's a bunch of other methods, but uh, DIRCOL will handle this no problem, or iLQR plus some constraint handling. An example of this is outro, which is ITERVLQR plus an augmented Lagrangian. Okay, so now we know that here are the different problems we can see in trajopt, and here are the different solution methods that we've learned so far. And so we can know when to use what. And it's really important that, if I get a problem that looks like this, I would feel kind of dumb if I was solving this with a convex solver when I can just solve it with Riccati. And I'd also feel kind of dumb if I was using like DIRCOL or ITERVLQR to solve this when I could just use Riccati. So again, it's very important to know what problem you have and what solver you absolutely have to use because these all get more and more difficult. And you want, for your online controller, you want the fastest thing possible and the easiest thing possible. And so, if you use a solver that's too complex for your problem, it's often a huge mistake. Okay, so now we can start our conversation about iterative LQR and DDP versus DIRCOL. And I know Zach talked about this. You're going to have a quiz this weekend that's going to go through all this. And then in homework 3, you'll be doing all this. And these takeaways are, I think, besides MPC, are probably the biggest takeaways from this class and things that people make mistakes on the most. And if you were to get interviewed for like, any sort of modern optimal control job, and you said you had experience with trajopt, they'd probably ask you these sorts of questions. So having this intuition is super valuable. All right, so let's do general iLQR DDP. I'll do green and red. It's easy to implement. So if you have to write it yourself, writing your own iLQR is not that hard. You'll do it in the next homework. You get a time varying LQR controller at the end of it for free. So after you solve it, you get a TVLQR controller that you can use to track your trajectory. And can be very fast. Also it's relatively easy to debug. So you can generally go stop the solver in the middle of it, take a look at what's going on in the solver and figure out like if this is something that is working and why it's not working. And if there's certain things that start failing, it's easy to understand why they're failing. So it's as far as solvers go to debug, it's pretty easy to debug. Now, the first minus is it's hard to consider constraints. Constraints are hard. Must use something like outro. And now this next one is probably, I'd say, probably the biggest downside to iLQR DDP. It's that now that we're doing non-convex optimization, it's really important where we start and how we initialize the solver. So when I initialize a convex solver, I don't even really have to. Like, unless it's numerically very poorly posed, convex solvers do not need babysitting or handholding. I can hand them a convex problem. They can start with nothing and they can return to me the global optima, the best solution available. With non-convex problems, totally different. The result of the solution is super dependent on what I initialize it with and what solver I use. So when we're in the non-convex land, this is kind of the Wild West. We really have to be super important about how we initialize these things. So for very non-convex problems, like a lot of robotic trajopt is, how we initialize this is super important. And with iLQR and DDP, you're very limited in how we're able to initialize this, which is too bad. And this is the biggest downside. So I can only initialize the U's, not the X's. Now, what's bad about this is that it basically means that my initialization has to be dynamically feasible. Has to obey dynamics. So I can only initialize U's. So when is this super difficult? Imagine if I had like a humanoid, like a walking robot, and you'll do this in homework 3. Imagine if I had a walking robot and I want to use trajopt to solve for controls that make my robot walk across the room. If I can only initialize the U's and I can only initialize the dynamically feasible trajectory, well, that's the whole reason I'm doing trajopt in the first place, is that I don't know how to make this thing walk. So all I can initialize it with is like, it starts to walk and then it falls over, and that's a bad way to initialize it. I'm not going to be close enough to my solution. Now, if I could initialize my X's and U's, I could have it kind of like, moonwalk through the air, and that would be close enough as far as where it begins solving and linearizing and taking all these approximations. I can put it closer to the solution by making this thing magically walk, and the solver will figure out what are the controls that makes that possible. So only being able to initialize the U's is really like such a painful part of using iLQR DDP, is that it really only works for systems where I can actually come up with a decent dynamically feasible guess. But walking, really difficult. Locomotion, really difficult. So it really only works for some problems. And this, again, this is a huge takeaway from the class. If you interview with somebody and they ask you questions about this, like really understanding all these pros and cons are important. Now, DIRCOL. I'm going to give you the pluses and minuses, and then I'll write out actually like what DIRCOL looks like. What DIRCOL looks like and how we actually do it in the homework and how you'll do it in homework 3. So DIRCOL, let's say, uh, actually I'll add, that's fine. Must use NLP or a nonlinear programming solver. So these are like IPOpt, SNOPT, NPSol, Nitro. There's a whole bunch of them, but IPOpt and SNOPT are the most common. And IPOpt is probably the most common because it is open source and it was made at CMU, which is cool, by a group in chemical engineering with Lorenz Biegler. They basically wrote IPOpt a long time ago and are still maintaining it, and it's used all over the place, which is cool. So you must use NLP solver. Actually, this is a minus. I shouldn't have started with a minus, but it's okay. It's the wrong color. Okay. So you must use an NLP solver. And the reason this is hard is because it's often kind of hard to configure these things. There's a ton of settings and hyperparameters everywhere, and it's relatively difficult to interface your code with it. Like if I gave you an hour and I said, I want you to like take an existing C++ program, I want you to plug in IPOP and start using it, it would probably take you more than an hour. So that is, I guess, the difficult part of this is that interfacing with these solvers is not that easy. What we've done in the homeworks in Julia is that we've done all that for you, and we've just given you a really, really nice, easy wrapper. And languages will often have tools that let you use IPOP, but to use, IPOP directly from their C++ APIs can be a little bit of a challenge. Not always, but it can be. So that's one downside of this, is that getting it set up to prototype things is often pretty tricky. A plus, I can initialize X's, U's, both, neither. So I can be way more specific about how I initialize this solver. And remember, for non-convex solvers, how we initialize is super, super important. So I can initialize the states. So say if I just want to walk, I could initialize my DIRCOL with just this thing kind of moonwalking across the room. And then the solver, because has the dynamics and the constraints, and we'll figure out a dynamically feasible version of that that starts pretty close to what you gave it. So it's much better to initialize with. Next thing, and we're going to see this in a second, is that I can use implicit or explicit integrators, and they both work just fine. So basically, it is just like the solver doesn't care. Now, normally when I do a normal simulation like we did in homework 1, whether we're using an explicit solver or an implicit integrator, it really changes how difficult it is to implement. And if it's an explicit integrator, I'm just taking steps and moving on. But if it's an implicit integrator, I'm using Newton's method to solve for every new step. So the process of simulating with an implicit integrator is a little more involved than with an explicit one. But for trajopt, it just doesn't matter, right? Because either way, it looks at it as a big constraint, so it just doesn't matter. And so we'll see this in the homework, and then you'll see this in a few minutes when I go and write this down. But this is a nice thing because oftentimes, implicit integrators are a little more accurate for the same order. So, a third order integrator like Hermite-Simpson for implicit or RK3 for explicit, Hermite-Simpson will be a little more accurate. And if it doesn't matter which one I use, I might as well use the more accurate one. And again, if I'm using a really nice, accurate integrator, I can take larger time steps, maybe have fewer knot points, have a smaller problem. So this is exclusively a win. It just doesn't matter what we use. And what Zach goes over in class when he does DIRCOL is he uses the explicit integrator. So the true definition of this, so if you use explicit integrator, it's technically called direct transcription. If you use implicit, it's called direct collocation. These like words really don't mean anything. Understanding the ideas is much more important. And often you'll see these words debated and changed all over the place. So don't get hung up on what these things are called. Okay, so minus is must use NLP solver. Plus is we can initialize X's, initialize U's, both neither. Explicit or implicit. Very easy constraint handling. So we're already doing things with the big NLP solver that's built to handle very gross constraints. So adding in more constraints is no problem whatsoever. And then I guess like a little more robust. So this one's very problem dependent, but maybe more robust than ILQR. So
For
it can be a lot more robust, which is in some problems really important. Does someone have a question?
yes, for trajopt, why doesn't it matter whether we use explicit or implicit?
So this is not for trajopt, this is for DIRCOL. And
Ah,
I'm going to go over this in just a few minutes because this is what we'll be doing in homework 3. And once we write out the full problem, you'll see why it doesn't really matter if we use explicit or implicit. Sound good?
oh yeah. Okay.
The last minus is that generally this is slower. So okay, so this is I know Zach gave a list pretty similar to this. This is my list. Probably differs just a little bit, but in general, all these things are true. So understanding when to use these methods and the big differences, super important. And the quiz will, like basically this quiz is going to ask you all these things and it's going to ask that you understand them. So going through this list, having it make sense is important. And now let's talk about DIRCOL. So actually I should make okay, I'll add an asterisk right here. And I'll say, see DIRCOL section. So the reason why is because here, the way I wrote this, if I write down my integrator like this, it must be an explicit integrator. If I have a function that takes in X in U and returns the next X, this is by definition an explicit integrator. I get inputs, I turn the crank, I give you an output. Whereas an implicit integrator, it has to satisfy some residual function. And we use Newton or a root finding method to do that. So now let's talk about DIRCOL, and let's talk about this problem setup. Uh, actually, I'll add one more plus. One more plus here is that I can use zero order hold, first order hold. I can use whatever I want to for the control. So we often do things with a zero order hold where we're saying that, we have n x's and we have n minus one u's. And this is just because we need the x and u to get to the next time step. I don't have to do that in DIRCOL. In fact, what Zach went over in class has me do a first order hold on the controls. So you can do that if you want to. These things aren't super important and they'll never really change how well a problem solves, but it's just nice to know that I don't have to use a zero order hold or a first order hold. I can use kind of anything I want to. So notice that this is not n minus one. This is n. I can use whatever. So let me actually check in the homework what we use. I can't remember. But in the homework, we do this in question one. We use DIRCOL, and I can't remember if we make you do a first order hold or not. Okay, yeah, so it looks like we also use a zero order hold. Okay, so in the homework, we use zero order hold, which is just the way that I'll write this here. Okay, anyways, here's our problem. Just some stage cost, then some terminal cost. Now the first constraint, initial condition, sorry. This is our initial condition constraint. And then our second thing is now we add the dynamics, and here's why we see that it just doesn't matter what we use. So I can do option one. I'll just call it implicit. So this is the first option is to use implicit. So if you remember from homework one, the way we described each of the implicit integrators is we said, here is what the residual function is that must be zero. So if I wanted to simulate this forward, I have an xi, I have a ui, and I would use Newton's method to solve for xi plus one. So when I simulate with an implicit integrator, I'm constantly using Newton's method every single time step to solve for the next state, xi plus one, that satisfies this residual between every pair of time steps. But if I'm just writing this down as a constraint, I can just write down the residual constraint. And this is the exact same as if I were to do this. I'll write implicit. So if I use an explicit integrator, I get my familiar So does this make it a little more clear of if I'm doing things in a constrained optimization form anyways, where I'm just handing off to a solver where I say, here's an objective, here's some constraints, here's everything. I can have either, the implicit integrator residual here, or I can just use an explicit integrator. But for the solver, it doesn't care, right? Because either way, you're just giving me a constraint that equals zero. So it doesn't matter if I give it the implicit residual that says this is true via the implicit integrator, or if I give it the explicit residual saying this is true via the integrator. So this is a super important concept, and we'll see this in the homework. you'll plan your trajectory with Hermite-Simpson because this is the classic direct collocation integrator that most people use, and this is what Zach did it in class. So when he talks about, you approximate the solution as a cubic, this is what Hermite-Simpson is doing under the hood. So this is classic DIRCOL, but I could use RK, RK2, RK3, RK4. I could use whatever explicit one I want to either way. And in the eyes of the solver itself, it really doesn't care. So you might as well choose the more accurate one. So you might as well use the implicit one. And this isn't super important, but it's worth understanding why you can use both, because to the solver, I'm just giving it an equality constraint. It doesn't care about simulating, it just needs an equality constraint. So let's say either or. And then we get our classic constraints, some equalities. So this is, if your problem looks like this, I can put it into DIRCOL. Now, how do we actually put it into DIRCOL? So what we've used so far to solve these optimization problems is we've used convex.jl. And what convex.jl does is it lets us reason about variables that are all sorts of different shapes. So, I'll have like a matrix of x's where each column is a new time step, and a matrix of u's. Each column is u from a new time step. And I can formulate my problem using nice, these what they call atoms. So I can say, CVX.quad form is doing my quadratic form. I can add my constraints doing prob.constraints. Like, it lets us specify these problems in a very nice, easy way. Now, the solver itself is always dealing with just one vector. It's always just looking to solve one vector. So what convex.jl does under the hood is it takes the problem as you write it, and it transforms it into a problem in one of the standard forms to hand the solver, solves for a vector, and then it returns everything back to the variables as you thought they were. And this is amazing. This is like, the biggest development in convex optimization is that these parser solvers exist, and they make using convex solvers so much easier, but they don't quite exist for NLP solvers. So there's something close called jump in Julia that we're not going to use, but it's very similar. It does kind of similar stuff. What we're going to do is that we're going to do it ourselves in this homework, which is nothing to be afraid of. It's just something you have to learn once, and you'll understand it, and you'll probably end up using it over and over again. So this is see how to use NLP. So NLP solvers, they want to solve things that, and let me bring up the form just to make sure I got it right. They want to solve things like this. They want to do min z. So the nonlinear programming solver, it really wants problems in this form. And this is how IPOpt wants things. This is how we will give things to IPOpt. That it wants everything in this sort of form, which is fine. I can put whatever problem I want to in this form, but it takes some transforming. So the way I wrote this right here, it's not natively in that form, but putting in that form is very easy. And this is what you'll do in the homework. Now, the most difficult part of putting a problem in this form and to this right here is that what do we do about the primal variables? So here the primal variables was this idea that, it's like a list of vectors. We have to solve for just one vector. So what do we do? We're gonna go ahead and stack everything up. And again, this is made super clear in the homework, and you'll have to do this, but the idea is that I solve for this where I stack up all the variables I want to solve. X1, U1, X2, U2, Xn minus 1, Un minus 1, Xn. So I stack up all the variables I care about, and I give you guys some indexing stuff, so it's easy if I give you a z, you can take out what the x's and u's are, and all that stuff is totally fine. And we can do this, and we can, with this definition, we can then put it into a problem like this. So I'm going to leave this a little open-ended because this is what we're doing in our homework. And I think that the process of thinking about how to take a problem where this is the primal variable and put it into this form such that we recover the solution to this. I think this is a really important takeaway, and this is kind of how the stuff works in the real world. If you go work for a company, you'll do stuff like this. So it's a super good experience, and you'll use it over and over again. So with that, we have a few minutes left. So any questions people have on any of these things? I know we went over a lot today. At a very high level, we went over all the different trajopt methods that we've learned so far. And then we gave a rundown on iLQR and DDP-based methods versus DIRCOL, when to use each and how to use each. And then in your homework 3, you'll get to use all these things and solve a problem of your own, which is fun. So that's it. Yeah. Any questions?
Hey, Kevin, I have a question. So you're
Mm-hmm.
mentioning for ILQR that we need to initialize that we only get to initialize the U's, but we don't get to initialize the X's. And
Mm-hmm.
is that only for the very first time step that becomes an issue, or is it for that we'd have to guess the U's for all the time steps that we're interested in?
So you mean time steps in the trajectory?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So we can only initialize this. We can initialize this with u 1 to n minus 1. So we can specify the u for each time step. And then the first thing the DDP or ILQR will do under the hood, first thing we'll do is it'll go do a full rollout. So basically, if this is u, so say u tilde is my guess, then I'll go ahead and do a rollout where I get my guess x. So this is my initializer. So I guess this is why it's important to understand, because I technically can initialize the x's and the u's, but it must be dynamically feasible. So if I feed it a bunch of u's, the first thing it'll do is it'll go do a rollout and it will get me my initial x's. Now, if I give it a nice dynamically feasible u that gives me a good trajectory, when it does this rollout, it'll give me a nice set of x's and u's. But oftentimes it's very hard. So if I have, like I gave a locomotion problem, the whole reason I'm using the solver is to figure out a way to walk, and I don't know a way to walk. So the way I initialize it is I just have to use some U's that are going to make this robot fall over, and that means our initial X's are going to be pretty bad. Where with DIRCOL, I can specify X's and U's without having them be dynamically feasible at the start. And this gives me way more freedom for starting off the variables as close as possible to how they should finish. Does that make sense?
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.